So as I said, I'm Elaine Provenzano. I'm very excited. Let me just grab my notes. Sorry. Very excited to welcome Stephen Paul DeVillo here tonight. I've known Stephen for several years through his initiatives with the Bronx River, and I was very excited when hearing about the book coming out. So Stephen is a local historian. He's the author of The Bronx River in History and Folklore, The Bowery, The Strange History of New York's Oldest Street, and the newly published The Battle of White Plains, Washington, and Howe in Westchester, which we'll be hearing about tonight. He is a longtime walking tour guide of the Bronx River Rambles and has given numerous talks and webinars on topics of the Bronx River, the Revolutionary War, and local history. A firm believer in research by walking around, he has explored on foot or on water every mile of the Bronx River and the battlefield of White Plains. So if everybody could please welcome Stephen Paul.
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to see everybody turning out. And I want to thank the Tuckahoe Library and the Provenzano family for this opportunity. And for me, this is I'm particularly pleased to be giving this talk here in Tuckahoe because the book was actually written here, or the first draft anyway. It was that long COVID summer, you know, I got my research in, and I spent the summer across the river in Macy Park, sitting on a bench right by that big, huge old catalpa tree, if you're familiar with the park. I just come up, get a frappuccino, settle in my little clipboard, and I get to work. So basically, the whole first draft was written right here. And of course, there's about 85 revisions afterwards. Anyway, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Battle of White Plains. It's something I no doubt you've heard of. Most history books you pick up will just skip over it. Give it maybe 2 paragraphs, sometimes maybe 2 sentences. And so, well, it happened and it was defeat for George Washington, and that was it. Skip on to the drama of the Battle of Trenton. It's a lot more complicated than that, I learned once I started getting into the research. And I'm going to share some of that with you tonight. Okay. Let's start at the beginning. Summer 1776. Okay, 4th of July, we enacted the Declaration of Independence. So that was the high point of the summer for the Americans. Things quickly started tumbling downhill from that point onward. Late August, the British invade land on Long Island. The Battle of Brooklyn ensues. A disaster for the Americans. As you can see, they're retreating pell-mell. And those waters there were Gowanus Creek, or today the Gowanus Canal is. And where that mill is standing, that's the foot of Sackett Street if they're going to go exploring in Gowanus. You see everybody jumping into the river. And, well, you wouldn't want to do that today, but it was not a total defeat for the Americans. Washington was able to get his forces out of the trap across the East River, and the battle shifted to Manhattan. The British landed on Manhattan 2 days later. Once again, Washington escapes the trap. They landed mid-Manhattan, hoping to trap the American army at New York City, which then was below Chambers Street. And again, they delayed, fiddled and diddled. Americans got past them up to Harlem Heights. Another opportunity to end the revolution was lost, which I'm rather grateful for. Now, at this point, it didn't look like the Americans were a totally defeated, dispirited force. To a great extent, they were. But there was a lot of aggression still left in the army. And they fortified the rising ground as you get into Harlem above 155th Street. And as the British approached, there was a meeting engagement that blossomed almost into a full-scale battle and turned into a British defeat. It was the Battle of Harlem Heights, which happened on my birthday in 1776, not 1956. But this gave General Howe pause. He'd been winning up to this point, but he had a great deal of respect for Americans dug in behind entrenchments and high ground. Why? Because he'd been the field commander at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Not watching from across the river, he was actually there on the ground directing the forces. British lost about a quarter of their attacking force that day. Every man in Howe's personal entourage was killed or wounded. Howe somehow got away from it, but he was literally spattering people's blood at some point. And this kind of thing could have an effect on your thinking. So he paused, before the fortifications in downtown Brooklyn. Yet he pauses before the fortifications in Harlem Heights. So what to do next? Okay, well, here's this problem. Now, Washington's there in the panhandle of northern Manhattan. Howe does not want to attack up south, up the stem of the panhandle, because again, he'd run into those fortifications. So the thing to do, and this is one of Howe's favorite maneuvers, do like a long end run, almost what we would call a Hail Mary pass in football. Hook around, get behind Washington. And if he could do that, if he could grab those two bridges, which are the only two routes on or off the island, dry showing, he could trap Washington. And once again, yet another opportunity for game over, revolution finished. Well, problem, land on the Hudson River shore, it's too rocky. No good landing place. Go up the East River, shoreline of what today we know as the South Bronx, too marshy and boggy, no good place to land. Best he could do was just in the elbow there by Frog's Neck. It's a good landing beach, but it wasn't too bad. It was about maybe 6 miles to Kingsbridge. You can get a force across Westchester Creek. It'd be a pretty quick march through West Farms, and it would be game over because Washington's still sitting there, northern Manhattan. Well, one of the first things they told people at West Point is no plane survives contact with the enemy, and this was certainly true here. Ran into a force there on the other side of Westchester Creek, 24 Pennsylvania riflemen. Doesn't sound like much. There's only one route across Westchester Creek. There's a bridge. There's no way to ford it. It's all very, very gooey tidal mud banks. Don't even think of trying to cross. I've done it. Trust me with this. So they tore up the planks of the bridge, settled down on the other side of the river, and sighted their rifles. And once again, the British were stymied. Howe spent 6 days trying to figure out what to do next. The British commander was not a man who could think on his feet very well or could come up with new plans once original plans were thwarted. So, sitting there for 6 days, it finally moves everybody a few miles up the coast to Pelt's Point. Today we know it as Rodman's Neck, where the police firing range is by City Island. Again, it was a good landing place, but you'd have to get across this time the Hutchinson River. And this time you ran into a much more substantial force, a brigade under General John Glover, who fought a delaying action, literally stone wall to stone wall, and forced the British general literally to waste an entire afternoon fighting over about 2 miles worth of country road. Meanwhile, Washington had caught on to what was happening and the danger he was in, and started moving out of Manhattan. A few days later, again, Howe was getting stymied there at Pelt's Point. He missed his chance to intercept Washington. Oh, what do we do now? So he moved everybody up to Newarship. Good place. It was a harbor. You get the Royal Navy in there to deliver many supplies and reinforcements, and start to figure out, what would be the next possibility. Again, the Americans are still showing that they're very aggressive, at least in terms of small unit actions. In Mamaroneck, he had a very interesting battle. They call it the Skirmish of Heathcote Hill. This is a hill. It's just literally overlooking the harbor there in Mamaroneck. And a force of Americans set out from White Plains to surprise this man on the right. That is the famous Colonel Robert Rogers, one of the great heroes of the French and Indian War. He daringly led the Rogers Rangers, and he literally wrote the book on small unit warfare in the American wilderness. To this day, the handbook of the U.S. Army Rangers prints on its flyleaf Robert's Rules for Ranging that he wrote in 1757. Yeah, it's still valid, but this is 1776, and Rogers is not quite the man he used to be. Fallen into debt, a lot of hard times. He was pretty much a practicing alcoholic at this point. It was, and neither was this unity formed around himself. Got together a group of people who wanted to recreate the legendary Rangers of the French and Indian War. And this time around, he got a bunch, farmers and kids and apprentices, and not frontiersmen. So the Delaware Regiment surprised them one night. They had a very sharp battle there in the Mamaroneck. Wasn't a great success for the Americans. It wasn't a loss either, but once again, it showed the Americans had a lot of teeth to them. They're willing to be aggressive. They're not a bunch of cowed, defeated men, slinking away by any means. So this again, gives Howe pause. He's going to have to approach Washington very carefully. Wasn't going to be the kind of knockover victory he thought it might have been. Okay, so what is Washington doing in the meantime? He's making his way to White Plains. And this is a very good depiction, kind of gives you the sense of the desperation of the early autumn of 1776. This actual sculpture, this is the Princeton Battle Monument, so kind of stealing from another campaign. He's making his way to White Plains. Now, his strategy at this point, he couldn't take on the British face to face in a full battle. Battle of Brooklyn pretty much proved that. His army was in very bad shape, very badly hammered. So he wanted to get up the Hudson, get into the Hudson Highlands. So you know that terrain up there, it's all hills and mountains, very rugged terrain. And he could settle in around a supply depot of fish kilns, like maybe 5 miles east of Beacon. Good secure location and buy enough time to just sit out the winter, reform his army, and live to fight another day. But why was he heading to White Plains? And most histories don't mention. They just say a battle happened here, and they'll give you a clue why it happened. And very prosaic reasons: flour and salted pork. There was a whole load of supplies that recently come in from Connecticut. She had a road from Danbury that came into White Plains. And all these supplies are stored in various places in White Plains. It had been a long summer, very bad summer. The Americans had been losing supplies and overfished. Washington at this point could not afford to lose not even a cup of flour. It was just that much down to the bottom, literally the bottom of the barrel. So what he would have to do, he'd have to secure these supplies, get them on the road north to Fishkill. That's easier said than done. First you got to get them all loaded up. And these are ox-driven wagons. You might make, perhaps 2 miles an hour at best. It was going to take time to get all this stuff up the road and securely tucked away in Fishkill. So what Washington would have to do, he'd have to get to White Plains first, get the flour into barrels loaded up on the road, and then he would have to hold a position in White Plains long enough for all the slow-moving supply train to get safely into the mountains before he retreated the rest of the army. So Washington got to White Plains. The first place he had his headquarters was, I was very familiar with this place, the Purdy House. His first hostess was a woman by the name of Abigail Smith Purdy. He didn't spend much time there because the Purdy House then was not on top of the hill where you find it today. It was down below the hill and what would literally be the front line of battle once the British showed up. So Washington had some advice. This fellow showed up a few days later. That's Washington's second in command, Charles Lee. A very, very curious and controversial guy. I won't get into him. He's worth a whole weekend's conference all by himself. I'll just say very socially awkward, acerbic, and he was one of these know-it-alls. But actually, he did kind of know it all because he had a lot of combat experience. He'd been an officer in the British Army for many years. In between times, he was a soldier of fortune in Europe. He fought for the King of Poland. I think he fought for the Turks briefly. He was like all over the place. But he had a lot of really practical on-the-ground combat experience that Washington did not have. So Lee was the kind of guy that was always full of advice. Anything, any situation, he had some advice to give you. And in his case, more often than not, it was good advice, and Washington would pay attention. So Lee got up there and he took a look at the lines as Washington was building in the White Plains. Wasn't happy with it. Wasn't happy with having headquarters in the Purdy House. So he had an alternative for George. Let's all move up north, up to Northcastle, and use this house as your headquarters, the home of Ann Fisher Miller, and build our lines on much more rugged ground than Washington was occupying in White Plains. Good advice, but it was a little too late in the day. The British were already on the march from New Rochelle and coming up from Scarsdale. But nevertheless, Washington Lee moved into the house of Ann Fisher Miller. And if you could imagine two more mismatched house guests, probably the original Odd Couple, they'd probably put Felix and Oscar to shame. Lee was I mentioned he was very socially awkward. He was very rough-mannered, very slovenly sort of person. And of course, Washington was always painfully correct in his manners. He'd bring you to tears. He was so polite sometimes. But Lee came along and he had a whole pack of dogs, Pomeranian dogs that followed him everywhere. And of course, the dogs would be doing, what dogs do all over the front lawn. And Lee inside would be breaking furniture and tearing curtains. But this would be the least of Ann Miller's worries, as we'll get to a little bit later. So we're moving up. Howe is approaching White Plains, and he's got to come up with a plan. He sees Washington is drawing up his main lines over a series of hills. Purdy Hill, where the house is located now, and Hatfield Hill, overlooking what today we know as Silver Lake. Okay, what do we do? These very well dug in positions. Of course, he's getting a little nervous. Americans in entrenchments mean trouble. So, okay, maybe I can do another end run. How about around, to the east, around Hatfield Hill? And that didn't work out too well. They sent a force there, and they discovered there was another set of entrenchments on Merritt Hill. And that didn't work out very well for the British. It was a single cannon shot, story has it. And they said, never mind, this isn't going to work. This gives you an idea of what Hatfield Hill looks like. Pretty much today, it hasn't changed very much. That's Silver Lake in the foreground. And this is a very, very high, very steep, rugged, rocky hill. You think twice about climbing it if you've got a bad knee. Not the kind of place you'd want to assault. So Howe gave up on this idea of hooking around Hatfield Hill very, very quickly. And that's the monument that's there today to commemorating the action at Merritt Hill. I see there's still one of them trying to get away from the cannon. So okay, so we got to come up with a plan. What are we going to do? If Merritt Hill's not going to work, we don't want to attack straightforward. Howe discovered he had another problem. At the last minute, literally just about the last minute, again on the advice of Charles Lee, Washington sends a force across the Bronx River and occupy Chatterton Hill, what today we know of as Battle Hill. Very nice neighborhood if you want to, if your house hunted, by the way. But this was an afterthought, but as Howe was approaching up the Mamaroneck Road, the scouts are telling him there's a whole force of men on Chatterton Hill. Now, Howe had been thinking of attacking straight ahead, but now you don't want to do this. As this is like the second thing they teach you in West Point, is you don't make an attack with a unknown force of the enemy right on your left flank. You have to think about what happens if these guys come down off the hill and start shooting your men in the back and the side. So whatever would have to happen, you'd have to deal with Chatterton Hill before anything else. And again, no plane survives contact with the enemy. He sends a force of Hessians down what today we know of as the Fenimore Road, and they run into a brigade under General Joseph Spencer, who incidentally, I'm pretty positive is a distant relationship of Princess Diana. Just, the name Spencer rang a bell. They did. Family was from Althorp. So I've got to see the genealogy worked out on this. But Spencer's men took up position again behind stone walls. Americans love stone walls. The British hated them. and once again, just like at Fells Point, started like a wall-to-wall running fight. I believe this may be one of the original walls that was in the battle. This is right along the Fenimore Road. I can't prove it. I may find proof one of these days, but it looks authentic to me. And these are the guys they were running up against, Spencer's men, Hessians. A lot of history books, they refer to them as mercenaries, and that's really, really not correct. Because these men were conscripts in various armies, various princelings, electors, counts, what have you. Germany at this time is something like about 350 different political entities. Some of them not much bigger than a postage stamp. But all of them had to have their own army, their own court, their own, grand duke or whatever. And so, of course, these guys were always short of money. And the British in 1776 were short of soldiers. We think the British were like this great tsunami of an army. They were not. Britain's always had a very small standing army. And they very quickly realized to subdue a place the size of the 13 colonies, they didn't have quite enough people to go around. And nobody was stepping forward to join the army to fight in America. So they sent agents to Europe, go around all these different little princes and whatnots. If you got regiments we can rent out, they would literally rent out entire regiments. So many men per head, so much payout for those who didn't return, so much payout for those who were wounded. It was all very, very cynical. Soldiers themselves didn't have any choice. Some of these guys were conscripted just for the purpose. They'd snatch people out of taverns, go for crossroads. The Duke wants you to serve in his regiment, and that was that. But they were some of the toughest men in Europe. These guys were trained brutally, but very thoroughly. And they, being good Germans, they followed orders, no matter what. And they knew how to do what they were told. And plus, they had those totally cool grass hats. Nobody had anything like that. You see guys like this coming at you, you have second thoughts about sticking around. So the first clash, the Battle of White Plains, is taking place along the Fenimore Road. And the Americans hold for a while, but they couldn't hold up. It was mostly militiamen. So they weren't going to stand that long against the Hessians. So they broke, they made a retreat down towards where there was a ford across the Bronx River. Ford is, to the best of my knowledge, is about where the railroad tracks are today. So you can't duplicate this this journey, but they're retreating through what today we know of as Green Acres, going to join the force that was assembling on Chatterton Hill. This is sort of like what Chatterton Hill looked like. This was a picture from about 1860, about 90 some odd years later, but very, very little changed from 1776, except for the railroad tracks that see the Bronx River. And you can see snaking up the hill, it's what was then the Dobbs Ferry Road. Today we call it Battle Avenue. And the little house there, by the way, was the house of farmer Michael Chatterton, who gave his name to the hill. So as I mentioned, the British are arriving, and Washington sends two of his best units to Chatterton Hill. These particular guys in blue were the Delaware Regiment. One of the very, very few units in the Army that actually showed up with uniforms, complete equipment, even bayonets. Most of the American Army, nothing like that. And they're quite a standout in camp too, so the other soldiers are calling them the Blue Hens Chickens, or more politely, the Delaware Blues. But a very proud unit, very good cohesion. And they dispatched two cannon to back them up. Now, these cannon may or may not have been accompanied by a very young college kid, a nice handsome dude about the age of 19 by the name of Alex Hamilton. And he wasn't famous. They hadn't made a musical out of him yet. But, and there's reason to doubt whether or not he was there on Chatterton Hill. Tradition has it he was. There's really no evidence for it. So you could debate, you could spend a weekend debating this back and forth. But nevertheless, now across the river there, and you see some puffs of smoke already, that's Fisher Hill, where the Fisher Hill neighborhood is today. And that's a hill that's just a little bit shorter than Chatterton Hill. But the British figured out this would be a good platform to put artillery. And before we try to charge up Chatterton Hill, pound the Americans with about 24 guns in an hour-long bombardment, which caused a lot of distress and casualties. The Americans did not break. And this is one of the signal features of Chatterton Hill. Yeah, I love my rocks. I'm an amateur geologist. And this particular outcrop, this is there on Chatterton Hill, which tells a lot of stories, but I won't get into it. The story we need to know for now is that Chatterton Hill is a great big upthrust of bedrock, but it's tilted to the east. The spine of this outcrop runs along the eastern side of Chatterton Hill, exactly where you needed to dig trenches in 1776. Well, now you can't. That's the side facing the British. Need to fortify it. What do? Men went to the west, in the middle of the hill. They were tearing up corn stalks from a farm, and they're piling up corn stalks into a barricade. And not a very good barricade, but it was enough. And if it covered your waist, it gave you some psychological advantage. But of course, you look at it from a distance, it kind of looked like, regular breastwork. So again, make the British hesitate a little bit. So getting the attack mounted, Howe is moving his main force into what was then not much more than a village of White Plains. He sends a brigade of British and Hessians west to confront Chatterton Hill. Now, the Bronx River, you knew I was going to get into the Bronx River. Now, all of you who have ever driven the Bronx River Parkway, this will be a very familiar situation to you. This was actually seen in my own neighborhood about a year and a half ago when the storm Ida blew through. And we had some truly epic flooding. That's Gun Hill Road there crossing what now is a river, but used to be the Bronx River Parkway. Bronx River is known as, it's called the Flashy River because it's in a very narrow rocky valley. And once you get some precipitation going, it tends to rise very quickly, tends to flood very quickly. And it wasn't this bad in October 1776, but it had been a very rainy autumn and the river was running very high. It was just a skosh below flood stage. So this means that at the ford there, where the Americans splashed through, the water was about chest high and ice cold. Remember, this is the end of October, not a time you want to go dipping in the Bronx River. I've done it. I don't recommend it. This is hypothermia country, but nevertheless, when the Americans had the Hessians after, so they splashed across. And one regiment of Hessians under a fellow by the name of Johann Roll, we're going to hear more about this fellow. He got his men across, but then he quickly realized there was nobody else following him. So he pulled back onto a little hill just immediately south in what today is Hartsdale. And if anybody could find out the name of this little hill, I would really love to know it. I've not been able to find any name to it. But the British had to pause, so they first mounted artillery in Fisher Hill, opened a bombardment, and then get the rest of the British and Hessians across. They hesitated. They looked at this water. We don't want to do this. Maybe we could build a bridge. Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's see if we can chop a couple of trees down, make a bridge, won't have to, get hypothermia or maybe drowned. That didn't work out. So these poor guys had to cross the chest high water regardless. But this was about another delay, an hour, 90 minutes. Daylight's burning, days running out. So they finally mount the assault. They bombarded the Americans for about an hour, and the main force crossed the ford and started working their way up Chatterton Hill. And this almost turned into another Bunker Hill. As they went up the hill, Americans down there firing down at them. And the Americans weren't playing very nicely either. They had a little custom called buck and ball. You load your musket, you drop in a regular bullet, which is about the size of a marble. Any of us are old enough to remember marbles. And then you drop in a handful of buckshot on top of the marble. And then you fire this thing. It's a combination of a musket and a shotgun, just mowing people down like crazy. There's no nice way of putting this. This was a very, very bloody affair. So they tried going up the hill, they're being blasted, lose their unit cohesion, they back down again, reform, made a second attempt, and that was turned back. And at this point, somebody remembered Colonel Rawle was over on the hill in Hartsdale, so he gets ordered into the action. But he's sitting there, he's watching all this going on, and he realizes he got a very good insight that the other British and Hessians were trying to charge up the steepest part of Chatterton Hill. Is that smart? No. So Rawle figures he led his men on a wide hook around the south end of Chatterton Hill, approaching from roughly about where Central Avenue is today. Coming in from the west, you got I would say a much gentler slope, but considerably better than the steepest part of the hill. As an example of the type of gun that was doing all the damage at Chatterton Hill, this was a howitzer. It's a picture I took in Williamsburg in Virginia. And the reason it's got this really short barrel is that these things were designed to fire exploding shells. Short barrel, you didn't fire these things from a long barrel because the friction might set it off prematurely. So you used a short barrel, you lost some range, but it was still quite deadly. Very primitive ordnance, really basically like a cartoon bomb. You know, it's Bugs Bunny gives to Elmer Fudd. It's like a sphere with this. Yeah, not very precise. It was only a couple of years after the war, there'd be a young British major who would rethink this whole design and come up with a much more lethal version of the shell. And guess what his name was? Henry Shrapnel. Yeah, that's where we get the word. Just a little footnote. I love this stuff. So anyway, so there's Rawle. He's figuring out what to do. He's looking around. That's not really him. That's a reenactor portraying him. But again, he had this incredibly disciplined brigade of Hessians behind him. So he sends them forward up the hill. And very difficult day for these guys. Now remember, these are guys who forded the Bronx River chest high, got soaking wet. They weren't quite dried out yet. Now they're advancing up through a wheat field, and they had to do a firewalking act. The field in various places was on fire, either on purpose or by accident. Nobody really knows. But you notice they're holding aloft. They kind of look like they're holding their clutch purses. Those are cartridge boxes with up to 60 rounds of ammunition. They're rolled up in paper tubes. You didn't want a chance of spark getting in there and blowing your hip off. So that's why they're got the musket in one hand, they're holding up the cartridge box with the other. So with both hands full, that means they couldn't stop and fire a volley. This gave the Americans a little bit respite that day. But they climbed the hill anyway, because you know they're Hessians, they do as they're told, no matter what. And there at the crest of the hill, they meet the two best regiments on the field, the Delaware Blues and also what remained of the Maryland Regiment. Guys who had saved the day at the Battle of Brooklyn 6 weeks earlier. And they gave them a very, very tough fight. They weren't going to run away. Oh, the Hessians are coming. No, they'd seen them before. They knew they could get shot just like anybody else. So they had a very pitched battle, but these guys by now were caught in a vise. The main force of British and Hessians were coming up the south side of the hill. And the guys on the left, the American left flank, were now caught in a vise. You had Rawle coming in from the west, everybody else coming up from the south. There was nothing to do. You had to slowly retreat. And this gives you an idea of the battlefield conditions. So it's one of the best pictures I ever took. You hear the expression, the fog of war. 18th century was not just an expression, this was a literal fact. Black powder is a very inefficient explosive, gives off gobs and gobs of white smoke. And this fog here, they'd only fired 2 volleys of this particular reenactment. You can see how conditions were. As they kept going, it just would get worse and worse and worse till you literally couldn't see what was in front of you. It got so bad that one group of Hessians that came up the south slope, and they saw the Delaware Brigade. Now remember, these guys are wearing blue uniforms, just like the Hessians did. So they saw these guys in blue uniforms. They assumed they were fellow Hessians, and stop, hold the fire. At this point, this is the kind of silly thing that only happens in the 18th century. The Delaware men heard this, the ceasefire orders, and very gallantly, good sportsmanship, fair play, and all that sort of thing. They raised their flags and they hollered out, "No, no, we're the Delaware Regiment. We're Americans." Okay, fine, level muskets. Let's go at it again. So the Americans were forced off the Chatterton Hill, and it was not a rout. They didn't run pell-mell like Americans were supposed to do. They weren't doing this anymore. They in a very orderly way, they fell back and they retreated down Battle Avenue past this monument, which you've probably seen going up or down the Parkway. And if you've ever wondered what it is, that's what it is. It's a monument to the Battle of White Plains, pointing downstream Bronx River to where the main fighting had taken place. So, okay, now we got Chatterton Hill, whoop-de-doo. It's past 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's October, not much daylight remaining. So British General Howe, that's him on the right, once again wants to pause. Well, I don't know about attacking the main line, and they've been fiendish casualties taking Chatterton Hill. 350 British and Hessians went down, and that is really incredibly bloody for such a secondary target. So Howe was getting the shakes from all this. So, okay, we better bring up some reinforcements from New York. Let's not do anything till the reinforcements arrive. But in the meantime, we've got to come up with a plan. We still have the main line of Americans facing us. Now, Howe's second in command, the guy on the left, Henry Clinton, very strange way, he was a counterpart to Charles Lee in his relationship with this commander. Another very acerbic, very socially awkward, even more socially awkward than Charles Lee. And another one of these know-it-alls that always had another idea no matter what it is. He's like Groucho Marx, like whatever you say, I'm against it. How they still work together, I'll never know. But I think Howe decided he'd pull a fast one on Henry Clinton. He knew he was going to criticize it. He planned to came up. So he tells him, okay, Henry, we got a day or two before the reinforcements arrive. So in the meantime, I want you to go out there, you ride around the terrain, and you tell me what our plan is going to be. He thought he was going to pull a fast one, but he didn't. I'll tell you in a moment. This is the idea that Henry Clinton came up with. Okay, well, send some artillery on a mad dash across the bridge in the Bronx River, and with forces from Chatterton Hill, occupy Juniper Hill. Now, as you go by, you're driving up the Tarrytown Road past the county center. Oh, keep your eyes on the road, but over to your left, you might notice a rocky outcrop, kind of like overhanging everything. That's Juniper Hill. It's about 1,000 yards from the crest of Juniper Hill to the crest of Purdy Hill. A bit long range for artillery, but nevertheless, get some cannon on Juniper Hill. This would create a diversion. It'll keep the Americans occupied and not shifting reinforcements around. Meantime, have another diversion and once again, take another crack at Merritt Hill. Make them think maybe we are going to do that eastern pass after all. And gather the main forces and send them right up what today is North Broadway, right through the center of the American line. Now, Clinton gave all this to Howe, and I told you there's going to be a catch to this. Clinton was such a contrarian. He had to start arguing against his own plan. This is the kind of personality this guy is. He's a very bizarre individual. So he gives all this to Howe, and Howe's nodding. And then he said, well, this isn't really not a really good idea. I mean, Juniper Hill is too long range from Purdy Hill to make much of a difference. And we did Merritt Hill before, and that didn't work then. It's not going to work this time. So Howe just listened to all this very patiently and decided he would skip the two diversions, get everybody together for one big punch up the North Broadway. It was 30th of October. Plans were set. We're going to do this. This is it. This is going to end the war. 31st of October, 1776. Woke up that morning. It's raining like mad. Remember I mentioned it was a wet autumn. It was still a wet autumn. Rain was coming down in sheets. Now, in 18th century, you could not fire a musket in heavy rain, or even high humidity would be great. Because you had like this open pan that kicked the spark, to set the whole thing off. So in rain, Gunplay is totally impossible. Now you would think, well, it's also impossible for the other guys too, but nobody's thinking of this. Howe didn't want to take any chances. No, let's cool it. Let's sit tight. Let the rain go by. We'll do it the next day. The next day, 1st of November, that'll be it for sure. And well, it might have worked because this was the target. This is North Broadway. And this is where the center of the American lines were. This is the kind of insights you get by research by walking around. Clearly the most vulnerable part of the American line. Instead of the high rocky hills, you had a Purdy Hill, Hatfield Hill, other places, got a long, gentle slope going up from what today would be Main Street in White Plains. It's a long walk, you take casualties, but it's nothing like the kind of mountain climbing you'd have to do in other places. And once you got there was only one single ditch was the entire defensive arrangements. And you can see a trace of that in this picture. Squint a bit over to the left. There's still traces of that entrenchment. And the mortar monument, that was a mortar that was found on the site many years later. British or American, there's debates about it, but I won't get into it. The yellow building, by the way, was also a tavern. That's a witness to the battle. It's a private home now. But I'm convinced if Howe's main force had come up Broadway, they could have easily punched through here. And once they got control of that road, that precious road, that meant everything for getting the wagons up for the line of retreat, might well have ended the revolution. But again, no plan survives contact with the enemy. We're all set up, rain cleared 1st of November, okay. Drums are playing, and everybody's getting in the line. And okay, this is gonna be it. We're heading up the road and we're gonna punch right through. And they got up there to the trenches and nobody was there. What happened? Well, what happened was Washington was pulling what was becoming one of his favorite tricks. Remember, he'd done this at the Battle of Brooklyn, getting everybody across the East River at midnight. He would do it again a few weeks later at the Second Battle of Trenton, just doing the sudden Houdini act in the middle of the night. So, well, where did everybody go? So they very cautiously followed them up North Broadway, and now they discovered the Americans are dug in on much, much better positions. In fact, the positions that Charles Lee had recommended in the first place. Miller Hill, Mount Misery, the worst hills in White Plains. Guaranteed, try climbing. And Foster Hill, and then the line bent back a bit on Hatfield Hill to link up with them. Incredibly strong position. Oh, okay, what are we going to do now? Well, that's Mount Misery was not a good line of attack. This is what it looks like today. Extremely rocky, very high. It's about 80 feet higher than adjoining Miller Hill. And it was named such by the troops who had to spend Halloween night there in the rain, trying to cook the rations as best they could. Well-named place. Howe took a look at this place and now this is not going to work. And just to the west, Miller Hill is almost as bad. This is a park atop Miller Hill today. And once again, you can see just barely a trace of where the entrenchments had been over on the far left, and where all the leaf litter is clustered. And to make it worse, look at the Miller Hill. Who's on top of Miller Hill? John Glover's brigade, including the Marbleheaders. Same guys gave everybody so much grief for the Battle of Pebbles Point. They're up there now, and this time they got much more guns than they did 2 weeks earlier. British made an attempt to attack Miller Hill. They went over to the western side, which is probably the least worst approach to try to climb Miller Hill. Didn't work. Glover opened up with his cannons. The attack fell apart before it even got started, and the British retreated. And for the next 3 days, they would exchange cannon shots back and forth between adjoining hill and Miller Hill. But essentially at this point, the Battle of White Plains was over. Now what happened then? How White Plains became the battle both sides retreated from. and both sides could claim a victory. 4th of November, word came to General Howe, much better opportunity. Thanks to a deserter, he realized that Fort Washington on the northern end of Manhattan, which had not been evacuated by the Americans, which everybody thought was impregnable, was not. It's much more vulnerable than anybody thought. So Howe figured, well, to heck with Washington, to heck with Westchester. Washington's going nowhere but further north. He's no threat to us any longer. Let's bend back, get to Manhattan, capture Fort Washington, secure the island, and have nice winter quarters, and we'll figure out the rest of this in the springtime. And that's what happened. Howe pulled out 4th of November and leaving Washington behind. Washington did not leave White Plains for another week. So you can claim Washington won the battle. He was left in possession of the field. Now, there's been a lot of various ways this battle has been commemorated over the years. And this is a mystery to me. If anybody can solve it, you will get fulsome notice in the next edition of this book. 100th anniversary of the battle, 1876. There was an organization, the White Plains Monument Association, and they had the idea of putting up a great big obelisk to commemorate the battle. They got as far as laying a cornerstone. And this is a picture of the ceremonial laying of the cornerstone on the exact 100th anniversary of the battle, 28th of October, 1876. Obelisk was never built. What became of this cornerstone? I don't know. I would dearly love to know. It's somewhere on Chatterton Hill. Obviously was left behind on Chatterton Hill. I've been all over the neighborhood peeking into people's backyards. I didn't get arrested, but I do it discreetly, hoping it'd be like, underneath somebody's barbecue, description, Battle of White Plains. I could find nothing that would answer the description. So I was thinking of putting up, flyers on the telephone poles, missing a monument, answers to the name of Cornerstone, but call this number. We do get desperate sometimes in research. But otherwise, it's commemorated. This is a commemoration a few years ago. It's a formal memorial ceremony at the Church of St. Paul in Mount Vernon. And they're saluting a burial of some of the men who died, Americans who died at the Battle of Pell's Point. But I want to point out the reenactors, these are guys who are reenacting John Glover's Marblehead Regiment. And you notice they're men of color. The Marblehead Regiment, the reason they were so tough, they were fishermen from Marblehead. And you had to be a tough guy to be a fisherman then as now. But back then, it was one of the very, very few industries in colonial America where a man of color could get some kind of equality. It was that bad in industry. When there's a storm out at sea, nobody cares if you're colored or not. The only question is, can you pull your weight? Can you be depended on, when the waves start crashing in? If you could do that, we're fine. You got same low paid, bad food, and mistreatment as anybody else on board. So Glover's regiment, we don't know exactly for certain, but probably at least a third of them were men of color. African, American Indian, combinations thereof. We just don't know. We don't have the demographic data, but at least a third of them would have been men of color, which made that the only unit in 1776 on either side that was integrated. And these modern reenactors, because you notice they're wearing sailors' garb from the 18th century, the short duck trousers, the floppy hats. Guy in the middle, actually, two of these guys are from an organization called the Gowanus Dredgers. Remember looking at the Gowanus Canal earlier on? These are men, they paddle, and the guy in the middle is actually going scuba diving. And yeah, braver man than me. I've told him this, says, you have my admiration. But what they do, they have their own commemoration of the Battle of Brooklyn. They have a commemorative canoe trip on the Gowanus Canal. And they do other canoe trips throughout the year. So looking for like a real urban adventure, check these guys out. It's great fun, but they're very good people, and they turn out for these commemorations. And of course, we've got the Heritage Trail. The which was laid out in 1958. Of course, the wayfinding signs are, showing some age by now. But nevertheless, you can still download a map. The route's about 11 miles long, and it links together just about all the sites associated with the Battle of White Plains. Probably better done by car than by foot, but a local Boy Scout troop actually had a merit badge for anybody who did this route on foot. You can check off all the places. And if you make the climb up what today is Battle Hill, then Chatterton Hill, Whitney Park has now become Battle Park, and it's replete with really, really good informational signboards, which pretty much tell you most of what you need to know about the battle, and I'll give you the rest of it. By exploring a little bit more in White Plains, there's other memories of the battle. This is the churchyard of the First Presbyterian Church on Broadway, about 3 or 4 blocks north of Main Street. The clump of flags there in the middle marks a mass burial of American and possibly a few British casualties from the Battle of Chatterton Hill. The church actually has a record of names if you need to look up any ancestors. But elsewhere in the churchyard too, there's other reminders that this was a battle in deadly earnest. It was not a fun or a sporting event by any means. And these tombstones tell a tale of a family tragedy. The light-colored tombstone, remember Ann Fisher Miller, who put up with Charles Lee and George Washington and all the dogs at her house. Well, spring of 1776, she had 2 sons, 2 of her sons and her husband, all eligible for militia service. They all went to war, same unit, the 3rd Westchester Militia. Elijah Sr. and Elijah Jr. and John. Elijah Sr. was badly wounded in some kind of a skirmish at a fort about where Gracie Mansion is today at the foot of 86th Street, Manhattan. And he was literally carried home to die. He died on August 21st, 1776, before the battle took place, and was buried in the churchyard. Elijah Jr. and John remained with the unit. They went through the Battle of White Plains. They weren't engaged in combat. They came through without a scratch, and everybody else think, oh, thank God, but don't get too thankful too quickly. They marched up to Fishkill with the rest of the army, and word came to Anne just 4 days before Christmas, 1776, that both Elijah Jr. and John were dead. Of camp fever, they both died the same day, the 21st of December. What's typhus, typhoid, who knows? These things are all just lumped under the term of fever. And Fishkill would become known as a notoriously unhealthy place. They get a smallpox outbreak about 6 months later. But nevertheless, Anne was able to bring Elijah Jr. and John and have them buried in the churchyard. And the odd thing is, her own tombstone went missing, if indeed she ever had one in the first place. And it took 2 local historians to literally locate where her remains were. And they were where you'd expect, like right next to her husband and sons. And they got a noted local stone carver, a fellow by the name of Bob Carpenter, to recreate a tombstone in authentic 18th century style to mark her grave. And the daughters of the American Revolution attributed a bronze plaque. So you can visit them, today if you're in the churchyard. As also Abigail Purdy, she's buried there too, with her husband Jacob. And Jacob went through the battle also. He came back alive, and they both lived to a very, very ripe old age. Abigail died 1839, age of 93. Just a few weeks after she'd put in an application for a Revolutionary War widow's pension. But, too late. But nonetheless, she's there. But her family, even though Jacob did not die in the battle, her family would have its own tragedies too. Because the war was a very, very divisive issue all throughout central Westchester. Many, many families were divided between loyalists and patriot, and particularly the Purdys. Jacob's own brother, younger brother Gabriel, was at the Battle of White Plains on the British side. Wasn't engaged in combat. They just put the loyalists in the back row, but nevertheless, when the war ended, about half of the Purdy's in Westchester were declared loyalists, and they had to move to Nova Scotia, which they did. And they founded their own settlement. And the list of settlers, it's almost the whirlpool of prominent 18th century central Westchester families. And they set up a settlement, and guess what they named it? Westchester. And there's a Westchester station on the map to this day in Nova Scotia. So there were a lot of small tragedies that accompanied the battle. Now, if you're wandering a little farther afield, you'll still find reminders of the battle. This is in Mount Kisto. And as the Americans were retreating north, they dropped off some of the more badly wounded from Chatterton Hill at a little church, St. George. Where this churchyard is, it's immediately south of where the hospital complex is today, if you're looking for it. And needless to say, field hospitals being what they were at the time, many of them died in care, and they were buried in a corner of the churchyard. Church is long gone, but you can still visit the churchyard, and there's still people there who will commemorate it with a proper flag. And even as far afield as Groton, Massachusetts, you'll find a tombstone referencing the Battle of White Plains. What happened here, this fellow Simon Patch was in the action at Chatterton Hill, took a very bad leg wound, a very bad festering leg wound, but his younger brother Jacob was in the army. And Jacob knew, like most soldiers, that field hospitals are not a place you wanted. It was like a one-way trip, really. So what Jacob did, and this is a masterpiece of improvisation, got hold of a horse. I don't know how he got hold of the horse. Maybe don't ask questions. He got hold of a horse. And he threaded a couple of saplings through the stirrups, and he rigged up what the Plains Indians would call a travois. 2 poles, some cross pieces, a set of bale of hay on top of that, and then he set Simon on top of the bale of hay, and they started walking 200 miles to Groton, Massachusetts. And he got Simon home. But Simon finally died of his wounds last day of December of 1776. And his tombstone mentions how he was sacrificed at the Battle of White Plains. So that's about all I have to tell you until the next book gets written. I want to thank everybody, but I also want to point out some organizations that if you don't already know about them, they're worth checking out. Just to pick a few from this area, there are many others. White Plains Historical Society. We do presentations and events at the Purdy House, the little red house in the White Plains. Daughters of Liberty's Legacy. Despite the name, they're open to men as well. I'm a member myself. They do a lot of events tend to center on the Miller House, the North Castle, as with the Friends of the Miller House, Washington's headquarters. And of course, shout out Eastchester Historical Society. Where would we be without them? Tremendous help in writing this book, I'll say that, and tremendous resource for anybody interested in local history. And the Brigade of the American Revolution. Some of our local reenactors are members. They're worth knowing because they have a lovely website. And you can go on the website and they will have a calendar of all the reenactment events that the brigade is participating in throughout the country. But you just scroll down and see what's happening in New York and when and where, and it'll give you an idea of how to plan your vacation. Because they reenact battles you've never heard of, as well as the most famous ones. And if you get to go to any reenactments, I'll tell you, take the time out, talk to these fellows. They are serious historians, and they really know their stuff. And they're more than happy to talk to you, even if you're a little kid, So anyway, that's all I have to tell you for now. If you got any questions, I'll entertain questions. I always find them entertaining. Thank you.